Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Leave in the comments where you are watching from, because the story we are going to share today has spanned centuries without ever being fully comprehended. It is the year 1824 in the Ozark Mountains, a rugged region sprawling across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. Back then, this area was practically a wild frontier, covered in dense forests, deep caves, and streams meandering between isolated valleys. The families who ventured to live here faced not only hostile nature, but also complete isolation. The nearest town with a doctor or any official could be days away by horseback. It was a place where secrets could be buried with ease, and where the line between the natural and the inexplicable became dangerously blurred. The Caldwell family had arrived in the Ozarks 2 years earlier from Virginia. Thomas Caldwell, the patriarch, was a man determined to build a life away from the pressures of the eastern cities. His wife Margaret, reluctant, yet obedient to the customs of the time, brought with her 3 children. Sarah was the youngest, a girl of only 11 years old, when the family settled on a remote property in Webster County. Neighbors were a rarity. The nearest house was nearly 10 miles away, separated by narrow, dangerous trails. At that time, the Ozarks had a dismal reputation among the settlers. There were tales of travelers who vanished without a trace, of strange lights seen at night among the trees, of sounds that did not belong to any known animal. But Thomas Caldwell was not a superstitious man. He believed in hard work, fertile land, and the promise of prosperity the territory could offer. Everything began to change on a cold October morning of that year. Margaret went downstairs to prepare breakfast and found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, completely still. The girl's eyes were open, but she did not blink. She did not respond when called. Her body felt rigid, as if it had turned to stone overnight. Margaret screamed for Thomas, who came running. They tried everything to wake their daughter. They shook her shoulders, threw cold water on her face, held a candle near her eyes to see if her pupils would react. Nothing. Sarah remained there, breathing almost imperceptibly, yet completely disconnected from the world around her. Panic gripped the family. Thomas mounted his horse and galloped down the muddy trail to the Henderson estate, the nearest neighbors. He needed help. He needed answers. But when he returned with Mr. Henderson and his wife a few hours later, they found Sarah exactly as she had been left. Not a single muscle had moved. The Hendersons, simple and religious people, suggested that perhaps it was the work of the devil or some kind of curse haunting those lands. Margaret, desperate, begged her husband to find a doctor, no matter how far he had to travel. Thomas left that same afternoon for Springfield, the most developed city in the region, located almost 160 miles away. The journey would take days. Meanwhile, Margaret and her 2 eldest children cared for Sarah, who remained in that frightening state. They carried her to bed, tried to feed her broth with a spoon, but the girl would not swallow. The liquid dripped from the corners of her mouth. She made no sound, no moan, no sigh. It was as if her soul had been torn from her body, leaving only an empty shell behind. The nights were the worst. Margaret sat by her daughter's bedside, holding her cold hand, praying quietly. She swore that at certain moments she felt Sarah's hand lightly squeeze hers, as if there was still some spark of consciousness trapped within that paralyzed body. When Thomas finally returned, he brought with him Dr. Elias Whitmore, a physician trained in Philadelphia who had moved to Springfield a few years earlier. Whitmore was known for his scientific and skeptical approach to the superstitions that dominated folk medicine at the time. He examined Sarah for hours. He checked her reflexes, listened to her heart with a primitive stethoscope, observed the dilation of her pupils under different light conditions. He measured her body temperature, which was unusually low, and tried to identify any signs of physical trauma. There were no visible injuries, no marks, no evidence of poisoning. Whitmore was perplexed. He had seen cases of catalepsy, a rare condition where the body enters a state of temporary stiffness. But Sarah did not exhibit all the classic symptoms. Furthermore, she had already been in that state for almost a week. Most cataleptic episodes lasted only hours, perhaps a day at most. The doctor decided to stay at the Caldwell estate for a few more days, observing Sarah's condition closely. He made detailed notes in his diary, describing every detail he could perceive. Whitmore noticed something peculiar. Sarah seemed to respond to certain external stimuli in an almost imperceptible manner. When someone entered the room, her breathing slightly accelerated. When there was absolute silence, she seemed to sink even deeper into that state of absence. It was as if she was trapped somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness, able to perceive the world around her, but unable to interact with it. Whitmore tried several interventions. He applied strong aromatic substances under Sarah's nose, hoping to provoke a reaction. He used bloodletting techniques, a common procedure at the time, believing that perhaps there was an imbalance in the body's humors. Nothing worked. The girl remained trapped in that inexplicable limbo. On the 10th day after the episode began, something extraordinary happened. It was late afternoon, and Margaret was sitting by Sarah's bedside, quietly humming a lullaby that used to soothe her daughter when she was younger. Suddenly, without any warning, Sarah's fingers began to move. First there were subtle movements. Then, she flexed her entire hand. Her eyes, which had remained fixed and expressionless for so long, began to move slowly, focusing on her mother's face. Margaret screamed with joy and relief. Thomas and Whitmore rushed into the room. Sarah was coming back. She blinked several times like someone who had just woken from a deep sleep. Her first words were a faint whisper, asking where she was and what had happened. The family was ecstatic. Dr. Whitmore, though relieved, remained cautious. He examined Sarah again and found that she seemed to have fully recovered. Her reflexes were normal. Her body temperature had returned to expected levels, and she was able to feed herself without difficulty. But Sarah Caldwell's story was far from over. 3 weeks later, on a clear November morning, the episode repeated. Margaret went downstairs and found Sarah once again in that state of total paralysis, sitting at the kitchen table, staring into space. The horror the family had experienced returned with a vengeance. This time, Thomas did not wait. He mounted his horse and went to fetch Dr. Whitmore immediately. The doctor returned, even more determined to find out what was happening. He spent weeks at the Caldwell estate, documenting every detail of Sarah's condition. He began to notice patterns. The episodes seemed to be triggered for no apparent reason, but they always occurred during the morning. Sarah remained in that state for varying lengths of time, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, she would return to normal with no memory of the time she had spent imprisoned inside her own body. Whitmore wrote letters to fellow doctors in Boston and New York, describing the case and asking for advice. The replies he received were vague and unhelpful. Some suggested hysteria, others spoke of spirit possession, and there were even those who proposed that Sarah was faking everything to gain attention. During the winter of 1824 to 1825, Sarah's episodes became more frequent. There were weeks when she spent more time in that paralyzed state than awake. The Caldwell family was on the verge of emotional and financial collapse. Thomas could barely manage the property as he spent most of his time with his daughter. Margaret had not slept properly for months. Sarah's 2 older brothers began to develop their own problems. They were terrified by the idea that whatever was affecting their sister might spread to them as well. Word about the Ozarks girl who fell into mysterious trances began to spread throughout the region. Curious neighbors appeared on the property. Some offered prayers. Others brought homemade remedies, promising miraculous cures. Nothing worked. Sarah remained stuck in her inexplicable cycle of consciousness and absence. Dr. Whitmore, now completely obsessed with the case, decided to remain indefinitely at the Caldwell estate. He turned a small room in the house into a makeshift office where he kept his medical instruments and journals full of notes. Whitmore began to expand his theories beyond the conventional medicine of the time. He read everything he could find about nervous disorders, cataleptic conditions, and even ancient reports of similar phenomena recorded in Europe. There were documented cases in France dating back to the 17th century of young people entering deep trance states, but none of them had the same recurrence and pattern that Sarah demonstrated. The doctor began to suspect that he was facing something completely new, a condition that medical science had not yet cataloged or understood. He began to obsessively measure every aspect of Sarah's life during the periods when she was conscious. He wrote down what she ate, how much she slept, her daily activities, the weather, the ambient temperature, even the phase of the moon. He desperately searched for some trigger, some pattern that would explain when and why the episodes occurred. In February of 1825, during one of Sarah's periods of lucidity, Whitmore had a long conversation with the girl. He wanted to understand her perspective, to find out if she felt anything before the episodes began, if there were any warnings that could signal the arrival of that terrible state. Sarah, now 12, was surprisingly articulate for her age. She described to the doctor that moments before losing consciousness, she felt as if the world around her was beginning to slow down. The sounds became muffled, distant, as if she were listening to everything through a thick wall. Her vision began to darken at the edges, narrowing until she could only see a small point of light in front of her, and then nothing. She had no memory of the time she spent paralyzed. To her, it was as if someone had completely erased her existence. One moment she was in the kitchen eating breakfast. The next moment, she woke up days or weeks later, confused and disoriented. Sarah also revealed something that left Whitmore deeply disturbed. She said she was afraid to fall asleep because she never knew if she would wake up as herself or if she would be trapped again in that empty, dark place where her consciousness disappeared. The situation became even more complex when Sarah began to show new symptoms during her paralysis episodes. Whitmore observed that on a few occasions while in that state, tears streamed from her eyes, although her face remained completely expressionless. It was as if on some deep level she was aware of her imprisonment and was suffering from it, but was unable to communicate her anguish. The doctor tried to develop methods to communicate with Sarah during these periods. He created a simple system where he asked questions that could be answered with minimal movements, asking her to try to move one finger for yes and two fingers for no. There were times when it seemed to work, times when Whitmore swore he saw deliberate answers to his questions, but they were so subtle, so inconsistent, that he couldn't be sure if they were genuine attempts at communication or just involuntary muscle spasms. This uncertainty plagued him. The idea that Sarah could have been conscious all this time, imprisoned in her own body, unable to scream or call for help, was absolutely devastating. Meanwhile, the community surrounding the Caldwell family began to divide in their opinions about what was happening to Sarah. Some believed she was under some sort of spell or curse, especially since the Ozarks had a long tradition of folklore related to magic and witchcraft. Stories circulated about wise women living isolated in the mountains, knowledgeable about ancient herbs and rituals. Others, more religious, saw Sarah's condition as a test of faith sent by God, or perhaps as punishment for some hidden family sin. There were even those who suggested the girl was faking everything, although anyone who saw her during an episode was quick to dismiss this theory. No one could maintain such a level of immobility and body control for days on end, especially not a 12-year-old. An itinerant preacher passing through the region offered to perform an exorcism, believing Sarah was possessed by an evil spirit. Thomas and Margaret, desperate for any solution, allowed him to try. The ritual lasted for hours, with the preacher shouting Bible verses and sprinkling holy water on Sarah as she lay motionless in her bed. Naturally, it had no effect. The spring of 1825 brought a brief hope. Sarah's episodes seemed to decrease in frequency. She spent almost 2 months completely normal, helping her mother with household chores, playing with her siblings, living like any other girl her age. Whitmore began to believe that perhaps the condition was going into remission, that Sarah's body had finally found some kind of balance. He considered returning to Springfield, confident the worst was over. But then, in May of that year, Sarah suffered the longest and most severe episode yet. She entered that state of paralysis and did not emerge from it for almost 6 weeks. During this time, her body began to waste away. Even with Margaret forcing small amounts of broth and water into her mouth, Sarah was clearly losing weight at an alarming rate. Her skin became pale and translucent, her cheekbones prominent, and her eyes, though open, seemed to sink into their sockets. Whitmore feared that this time she would not survive. He spent entire nights by her side, constantly checking her weak pulse and shallow breathing, fearing her heart might simply stop beating at any moment. It was during this extended episode that something truly extraordinary happened. Something Whitmore recorded in his diaries with a mixture of scientific fascination and horror. On a particularly warm June night, he was sitting by Sarah's bedside, taking his notes by candlelight. The house was silent. Everyone had already gone to sleep. Suddenly, Sarah started making sounds. These were not recognizable words, but low, continuous murmurs that seemed to come from deep within her throat. Whitmore approached immediately, his heart racing. He tried to understand what she was saying, but the sounds did not form any language he knew. They were strange, almost melodious, yet deeply disturbing at the same time. They lasted only a few minutes before abruptly ceasing, leaving Sarah in her usual state of absolute silence. Whitmore stayed up the rest of the night trying to phonetically transcribe what he had heard, but his notes made no sense. He never mentioned this incident to the Caldwell family, fearing it would only add to their grief and confusion. But that moment haunted him for the rest of his life. When Sarah finally emerged from that 6-week episode, she was fundamentally changed. Physically, she was weak and needed weeks of intensive care to regain her strength. But there was something else, something everyone around her noticed, but no one could precisely define. Her eyes had a different quality, a depth that had not been there before. She spoke less and observed more. Sometimes in the middle of an ordinary conversation, she would simply stop and gaze at the horizon with a distant expression, as if she was seeing or hearing something that no one else could perceive. Margaret confided in Dr. Whitmore that she no longer fully recognized her daughter. It wasn't that Sarah was hostile or awkward, but there was a kind of subtle disconnect, as if a part of her had been left behind in that dark place where her consciousness vanished during the episodes. Thomas, on the other hand, was simply grateful to have his daughter back, regardless of any changes in her behavior. He had aged years in just a few months. His hair was noticeably grayer, and deep lines of worry were permanently etched on his face. The summer of that year passed relatively quietly. Sarah had only 2 brief episodes, each lasting less than a week. Whitmore continued his observations, but began to accept that he might never fully understand what was happening. He expanded his documentation to include not only the medical aspects of the case, but also the psychological and social impacts on the family and the surrounding community. His diaries became a fascinating record, not only of a mysterious medical condition, but of how a family on the American frontier dealt with the unexplained at a time when science still had much to discover. Whitmore also began to theorize that there might be other similar cases scattered across the country. People who suffered from similar conditions but lived in areas so remote that they never came to the attention of the medical community. The Ozarks, with their vastness and isolation, could be hiding dozens of mysteries similar to Sarah Caldwell's. This idea intrigued and disturbed him in equal measure. How many other Sarahs were out there, trapped in their own bodies, with no one to document or try to understand their suffering? In the autumn of 1825, an unexpected event brought a new dimension to the case of Sarah Caldwell. A group of scholars from the University of Virginia, who had received correspondence from Dr. Whitmore about the case, decided to make the long journey to the Ozarks to observe Sarah in person. There were 3 men: Professor Jonathan Blackwell, a specialist in nervous disorders; Dr. Samuel Green, who studied cataleptic phenomena; and a young assistant named William Marsh, who was in charge of making detailed illustrations and written records. Their arrival caused considerable unrest at the Caldwell estate and in the surrounding community. This isolated region rarely received such distinguished visitors, men of formal education from the civilized East. Thomas Caldwell, though suspicious at first, allowed them to examine his daughter, hoping that perhaps these men of science would have answers that Dr. Whitmore had not been able to find. The 3 scholars spent weeks on the property, settling in a nearby abandoned cabin that the Hendersons had made available to them. Professor Blackwell brought with him equipment that no one in that region had ever seen. There were devices for measuring electrical currents in the human body, a concept that was just beginning to be explored in medicine at the time. He believed that nervous disorders like Sarah's could be related to disruptions in what he called the electrical life force that ran through the body. During one of Sarah's episodes, Blackwell conducted a series of experiments that today would be considered rudimentary, but which at the time represented the pinnacle of scientific knowledge. He applied small electrical currents to different parts of Sarah's body, noting if there were any muscle responses or changes in her state. The results were inconsistent and disconcerting. On some occasions, Sarah's muscles contracted slightly under the electrical stimulus, but there was no discernible pattern. There didn't seem to be any significant difference between her responses and those that would be expected from anyone in a state of deep unconsciousness. Blackwell was deeply frustrated, but also fascinated. He began to develop a theory that perhaps Sarah's problem was not in the physical body, but in some deeper layer of consciousness that science did not yet have the means to access. Dr. Green, for his part, focused his attention on comparing Sarah's case with other documented cases of catalepsy around the world. He had brought with him an impressive collection of medical manuscripts, some dating back centuries, that described superficially similar conditions. In the evenings, by the light of oil lamps, Green read aloud to Whitmore and the other scholars, sharing accounts of medieval monks who went into deep trances, of Victorian women who fell into states of suspension that lasted for days, of cases in India where yoga practitioners were able to voluntarily decrease their bodily functions to almost imperceptible levels. But in each comparison, there were crucial differences. The monks chose to enter their trances through meditation. Victorian women often had other symptoms of hysteria. Indian yogis had conscious control over their states. Sarah had no choice, no control, and no symptoms associated with the other conditions. Green eventually concluded that Sarah's case was genuinely unique, or at least extremely rare. He suggested that perhaps they were witnessing a new category of neurological disorder that had not yet been named or classified by medicine. William Marsh, the young assistant, played a crucial role that is often overlooked in historical records. His detailed illustrations of Sarah, both in states of consciousness and paralysis, provide to this day a visual window into the case. Marsh had an exceptional talent for capturing not only the physical appearance, but also the emotional essence of his subjects. His drawings of Sarah during the episodes are particularly disturbing. They show a girl who seems to be simultaneously present and absent. her eyes open but empty, her body relaxed but somehow tense, like a porcelain doll perfectly positioned. Marsh also documented the Caldwell family, creating an intimate portrait of the strain that this situation had caused on each member. Margaret's tired face, Thomas's hunched posture under the weight of constant worry, the frightened expression of Sarah's siblings. These illustrations, preserved in university archives, became valuable historical documents, not only of the medical case, but of life on the American frontier during that period. Marsh also kept a personal diary where he recorded his most subjective impressions. He wrote about how the Ozarks had an oppressive quality, especially at night when the sounds of the forest seemed to amplify and the shadows became deep and impenetrable. During the scholar's stay, Sarah had 3 episodes. The second of these was particularly significant because it took place while all observers were present and were able to document every detail from the beginning. It was a foggy October morning. Sarah was helping her mother prepare breakfast when she suddenly dropped the plate she was holding. She didn't try to catch it. She just stood there, staring into the space in front of her. Margaret recognized the signs immediately and called everyone. In a matter of minutes, the kitchen was full of observers. Whitmore, Blackwell, Green, and Marsh surrounded Sarah, each with their own instruments and notebooks. They documented the exact moment when her eyes lost focus, when her breathing began to slow down, when her body took on that characteristic stiffness. Blackwell measured her body temperature every 15 minutes for the first few hours, noting a gradual but noticeable drop. Green tested her reflexes repeatedly, finding that some disappeared completely while others remained partially functional. Marsh made a series of quick sketches, capturing the episode's progression in real time. It was an unprecedented opportunity for scientific observation, but it was also deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. There was something inherently disturbing about treating Sarah like a study specimen while she was trapped in that terrible state. This episode lasted 11 days. During this period, the scholars tried practically everything that the science of the time allowed. They applied different aromatic substances, tested responses to sounds of different frequencies, tried tactile stimulation, ranging from soft touches to firmer pressures. Blackwell even conducted a controversial experiment where he applied a stronger electric current than he had tried before, hoping to provoke some kind of sudden awakening. The current caused violent muscle contractions in Sarah's arm, but it did not bring about a change in her state of consciousness. Margaret had to be removed from the room during this experiment, unable to watch what appeared to be torture of her daughter, even if it was in the name of science. When Sarah finally woke up, she had no memory of anything. She felt no residual pain from the electric currents. She was unaware of having been the object of so many experiments. It was, as always, a complete emptiness, where 11 days of her life should have been. The scholars were torn between disappointment that they had not been able to find a cure or even a definitive explanation and relief that Sarah had returned without apparent harm. Before leaving back for Virginia, the 3 scholars met with the Caldwell family and Dr. Whitmore to share their findings. Professor Blackwell spoke first, admitting with unusual humility that medical science simply did not have enough tools or knowledge to explain what was happening to Sarah. He believed that the answer lay somewhere in the complex interplay between mind and body, but the exact mechanisms remained beyond current understanding. Dr. Green agreed, adding that perhaps 50 or 100 years from now, when medicine would have advanced significantly, cases like Sarah's could be understood and treated. But for now, all they could offer was careful documentation and the hope that the observations could eventually contribute to future medical knowledge. They advised the family to continue providing Sarah with all the care and love possible, to keep her fed and hydrated during the episodes, and to be patient. There was no cure. There was no treatment. just the expectation that perhaps in time the condition could go into permanent remission. It was a devastating conclusion for the Caldwell family, but in some ways it also brought a strange sense of closure. At least now they knew that they were not failing to do something obvious, that there was no magical cure that they were ignoring. After the departure of the Virginia scholars, life on the Caldwell estate began to take on a grim but stable routine. They learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that Sarah could enter one of her states at any time. Margaret developed an elaborate system of care for periods of paralysis, ensuring that Sarah was changed positions regularly to avoid pressure sores, that her mouth was kept clean and moist, that small amounts of nourishing liquid were administered several times a day. Thomas built a special chair with padded supports, where Sarah could be positioned during the day, allowing her to be a part of family life even when she was away. The older brothers, initially terrified by their sister's condition, gradually learned to accept and even help with her care. It was a difficult and sometimes desperate existence, but there were moments of grace as well. In periods when Sarah was conscious, she demonstrated a deep appreciation for life that many considered beyond her years. She valued every waking moment, every conversation, every sunset she could observe from the windows of the house. There was an intensity to her presence during these periods that was simultaneously beautiful and tragic. The winter of 1825 to 1826 was particularly brutal in the Ozarks. Heavy snowfall isolated the Caldwell property for weeks on end. During this period, Sarah had 2 prolonged episodes that overlapped in such a way that she spent almost the entire winter in that state of paralysis. It was a dark time for the family. The accumulated snow blocked the windows, reducing the natural light inside the house to a perpetual twilight. The cold was so intense that even with the fireplace constantly lit, ice formed on the inside walls. Margaret could barely keep Sarah warm, wrapping her in all the blankets and furs the family owned. Thomas spent his days chopping wood and trying to maintain some connection with the outside world, making his way through the snow to get to the barn and care for the animals. Dr. Whitmore had returned to Springfield before the winter, taking with him years of documentation about Sarah. He promised to continue studying the case and to maintain correspondence with the family, but everyone knew that during the winter months, no letter would arrive or depart from that isolated property. They were alone with their mystery, surrounded by miles of frozen forest and oppressive silence. When spring finally arrived in 1826, bringing with it the thaw and the return of migratory birds, Sarah emerged from her long period of absence. But this time there was something different, something that worried Margaret deeply. Sarah woke up talking about dreams, or at least that's how she described them. She told fragmented stories about being in places she couldn't identify, dark corridors that stretched endlessly, voices that called her name but always seemed to come from a direction that was impossible to reach. She described sensations of falling through layers of darkness, each denser than the last, until she reached a place where there was no more light, sound, or sensation at all. Margaret did not know how to interpret these descriptions. Were they really dreams? Or was Sarah somehow conscious during her episodes of paralysis, trapped in some terrifying state of mind? The possibility was too horrible to fully contemplate. Sarah also mentioned something that made her mother particularly upset. She said that in the final moments before waking up, she always felt the presence of something or someone nearby, something that wasn't hostile, but wasn't exactly benevolent either. It was just an observant presence, waiting. Thomas tried to maintain rationality in the face of these revelations. He argued that they were just the confused daydreams of a young mind trying to process an inexplicable experience. But even he couldn't deny that there was something fundamentally disturbing about Sarah's words. The Henderson neighbors, who visited occasionally when the trails were passable, brought back old stories of the Ozarks that their own families had passed down from generation to generation. They talked about the mountains being places of power where the veil between the physical world and something beyond was thinner. They mentioned native shamans who had lived in that region centuries earlier, who were supposed to be able to travel between worlds through deep trances. Thomas rejected these stories as rural superstition, but Margaret found in them a strange kind of comfort. Perhaps Sarah was not sick in the conventional sense. Perhaps she had some kind of unusual sensibility and openness to aspects of existence that most people would never experience. It was an interpretation that at least gave some meaning to her daughter's inexplicable suffering. During the spring and summer of that year, Sarah's episodes began to feature new characteristics that intrigued and alarmed everyone. She began to murmur words during her states of paralysis, always in the deepest moments of the night. Margaret, who often lay awake next to her daughter, was usually the only witness. The words were disjointed, fragments of sentences that did not form complete thoughts. Sarah talked about cold and darkness, about being lost, about looking for a way out she couldn't find. Sometimes she would mention names that no one in the family recognized, calling out to people who apparently did not exist. On one occasion, she repeated the word cave several times, her voice a hoarse whisper that barely escaped her paralyzed throat. This was particularly intriguing because the Caldwell estate was relatively close to one of the many caves that dotted the Ozarks, vast and largely unexplored underground systems that stretched for miles under the mountains. Thomas had briefly explored the entrance to the nearest cave years earlier, but deemed it too dangerous to allow the children to approach. The repeated mention of caves during Sarah's episodes led Thomas to reconsider that subterranean space. One afternoon in July, he decided to explore the cave more deeply, taking with him flashlights and ropes. What he discovered made him deeply uncomfortable. The cave stretched far beyond what he had imagined, its tunnels branching off in dozens of different directions. In some chambers, he found strange rock formations that seemed almost deliberately arranged, although he knew it was only the work of water and time. But there was something else, something he couldn't define precisely, a kind of oppressive atmosphere that seemed to increase the deeper he went. Strange sounds echoed through the passageways, impossible to identify as dripping water, wind, or something else entirely. In a particularly deep chamber, Thomas found what appeared to be ancient marks on the walls, symbols or designs so weathered that they were almost unrecognizable. He didn't know if they were the work of Native Americans from centuries past, or just natural patterns in the rock that his anxious mind was interpreting as intentional. Be that as it may, he left that cave quickly and never returned. When Thomas told Margaret about his exploration of the cave, she was strangely silent for a long time. Finally, she revealed that Sarah had mentioned something specific during one of her nightly murmurs. She had talked about stone walls and running water, about walking through tunnels that never ended. Margaret hadn't made a big deal out of it before, assuming they were just fragments of nightmares, but now the coincidence seemed too significant to ignore. Thomas suggested that perhaps Sarah had explored the cave alone at some point, unbeknownst to them, and that this had left deep impressions in her mind that now surfaced during her episodes. But Margaret was sure that Sarah had never ventured so far from the house alone. The family always kept the children close, aware of the dangers of the isolated region. The idea that Sarah was somehow visiting those subterranean spaces in her altered states of consciousness was disturbing but impossible to prove or disprove. It was just another layer of mystery in a case already rife with inexplicability. In the fall of 1826, a letter arrived from Dr. Whitmore, which brought both encouraging and discouraging news. He had presented Sarah's case at a medical conference in Boston, sharing his extensive notes and the observations of the Virginia scholars. The response was mixed. Some doctors showed great interest and suggested several theories, although none were particularly convincing. Others were skeptical, suggesting that perhaps there was some element of role play, or that the family was exaggerating the symptoms. Whitmore vehemently defended the legitimacy of the case, but admitted in the letter that without being able to bring Sarah in person for demonstration, many would remain doubtful. The encouraging part of the letter was that a New York doctor who specializes in sleep disorders expressed interest in traveling to the Ozarks to examine Sarah in person. His name was Dr. Elijah Thornton, and he had studied cases of narcolepsy and other disorders related to consciousness. Whitmore wrote that Thornton planned to make the trip the following spring when travel conditions improved. There was a spark of renewed hope that perhaps this new expert could offer insights that others had missed. But that hope would never be realized. In December of 1826, Sarah entered into an episode that would last the entire winter season. This time, her body responded differently to the prolonged state of paralysis. She began to lose weight at an alarming rate. Even with Margaret's constant efforts to feed her, her skin acquired a ghostly pallor, almost translucent in the thinnest parts, such as the eyelids and hands. Her breathing became so shallow that it was sometimes difficult to detect if she was still alive. Thomas rode through a dangerous blizzard to try to get medical help, but the nearest doctor was miles away, and weather conditions made the journey nearly impossible. The family was isolated again, watching helplessly as Sarah seemed to slowly waste away. Margaret spent whole nights at her daughter's bedside, refusing to sleep, fearing that if she closed her eyes for a moment, Sarah might leave without her being there. She talked to her daughter incessantly, telling stories, singing songs, begging her to fight and come back. Thomas tried to stay strong, but the desperation in his eyes was visible whenever he looked at Sarah. In February of 1827, on a particularly cold morning where the wind howled through the cracks of the house, something changed. Sarah began to tremble slightly, her fingers twitching in ways that hadn't happened in months. Margaret, who was by her side as always, immediately noticed the change. She called Thomas and the other children. They gathered around the bed, barely daring to breathe as they watched. Slowly, very slowly, Sarah's eyes began to gain focus. She blinked for the first time in nearly 3 months. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but no sound came out initially. Margaret took hold of her daughter's hand, tears streaming freely down her face. Sarah squeezed weakly back. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she whispered a single word that neither of them would ever forget. She said, "Cold," her voice so weak it was barely audible. But she was awake. She was back. The family burst into tears of relief and joy. Sarah had survived the longest and most dangerous episode so far, but the cost had been high. Her body was devastated, so weak that she could barely lift her head. It would take months for her to regain any significant strength. Sarah's recovery was slow and painful. She had to relearn how to walk. Her muscles had atrophied so much during the long period of immobility that they could barely support her weight. Margaret prepared special nutritious broths, forcing Sarah to eat small portions several times a day. Thomas built simple parallel bars in the barn, where Sarah could practice walking, holding on to keep her balance. It was a frustrating and sometimes humiliating process for a girl who had previously been active and independent. But Sarah demonstrated remarkable determination. She refused to give up, even on days when the pain was intense and progress seemed non-existent. There was something different about her now, a quality that everyone noticed, but no one could properly name. It was as if that long period of absence had changed something fundamental in her being. Her eyes had a depth that shouldn't exist in someone so young, as if she had seen or experienced things that were beyond normal comprehension. She spoke less than before, but when she did, her words carried a peculiar weight that made people pay attention. During the spring of 1827, while Sarah was continuing her physical recovery, something extraordinary happened. She stopped having the episodes. Weeks passed, then months, and no sign of that terrible state of paralysis returned. At first, the family hardly dared to believe it. They lived in constant expectation that at any moment Sarah might re-enter that state. But as time passed, and she remained conscious and present, a cautious hope began to grow. Perhaps finally the condition had passed. Perhaps that last brutal episode had been the end of an inexplicable cycle. Dr. Thornton of New York finally arrived in May of that year, as he had promised. But now he found a completely different situation than he expected. Instead of a patient in the midst of recurring episodes, he found a young convalescent woman who had not had symptoms for months. He conducted extensive examinations nonetheless, documenting Sarah's current state and meticulously reviewing all the notes Whitmore and the others had taken. Thornton was fascinated by the case, but also frustrated that he could not observe the episodes firsthand. He stayed in the region for almost a month, hoping that perhaps Sarah would have a recurrence, but she remained stable. Before leaving, Dr. Thornton spent long hours talking to Sarah, trying to understand her perspective on everything that had happened. These conversations, recorded in his journals, provide a unique insight into Sarah's experience. She described to Thornton how the episodes always began with a feeling of gradual disconnection from the physical world, as if she were being pulled away from her own body. During what she called her absence, Sarah said that she existed in a space that was not exactly darkness or light, but something in between. She talked about being aware that time was passing, but in a distorted way, where minutes could seem like hours, and days could pass like seconds. Most disturbing was her description of not being completely alone in these states. Sarah insisted that there was something else there with her, a presence that she could not see or touch, but that she could feel watching. When Thornton pressed for more details, asking if this presence was threatening, Sarah would think for long moments before answering. She said it wasn't exactly threatening, but it wasn't comforting either. It was just a silent witness to her imprisonment. Thornton was also particularly interested in the fact that Sarah had stopped having the episodes after that prolonged 3-month period. He theorized that perhaps Sarah's body had finally developed some kind of defense mechanism or neurological compensation. Another possibility he considered was that the episodes were related to some developmental process that her body had completed. Sarah was now 14, entering her teens, and Thornton knew that significant hormonal changes occurred at this stage of life. Perhaps these changes had somehow corrected the imbalance that caused the episodes. It was a plausible theory, but impossible to prove. Thornton left the Caldwell estate with a mixed sense of scientific fascination and professional frustration. He promised to keep up correspondence and asked the family to inform him immediately if Sarah had any recurrence of symptoms. He also left a small amount of money as compensation for the family's cooperation. A gesture that Thomas initially refused, but eventually accepted when Margaret pointed out how much they had spent on medical care over the years. The following months brought a sense of normalcy that the Caldwell family hadn't experienced in years. Sarah continued her recovery, gradually regaining her strength and returning to participating in household chores. She learned to sew from Margaret, helped in the garden, and even began teaching her younger siblings to read, using the old family Bible and some books that Dr. Whitmore had left her. There were times when it was possible to forget everything that had happened, times when life seemed almost ordinary. But Sarah was never quite the same person she was before the episodes began. She had a gravity, a seriousness that children her age did not normally possess. Sometimes Margaret caught her staring out the window with a distant expression, as if part of her was still stuck in that place between consciousness and absence. When asked what she was thinking in those moments, Sarah usually smiled and said it wasn't important at all. But her eyes told a different story, suggesting thoughts and memories she had learned to keep to herself. In the summer of 1828, more than a year after her last episode, Sarah began to have vivid nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night screaming in a cold sweat, muttering about being trapped again. Margaret would run to her room and hold her until she calmed down, assuring her that she was awake, that she was safe, that the episodes were over. But the nightmares persisted, occurring several times a week. Sarah would describe dreams where she was back in that liminal space, but this time, the walls seemed to be closing in, the space getting smaller and smaller until she felt like she would be crushed by the pressure. In other dreams, she walked through those stone tunnels she had mentioned before, desperately searching for a way out she could never find. The presence she felt during her episodes also appeared in her dreams, now closer, more tangible, though still impossible to see clearly. The nightmares began to affect her health. Sarah was constantly tired with deep, dark circles under her eyes. She lost the appetite she had worked so hard to regain. Margaret and Thomas became concerned that perhaps the episodes were returning in a different form, manifesting themselves through dreams rather than physical paralysis. Thomas decided to seek advice from a woman who lived in the mountains west of his property, someone the Hendersons had mentioned several times. Her name was Abigail Crowley, and she had a reputation in the region for understanding things that doctors could not explain. Some called her a healer, others a witch, but all agreed that she had knowledge that came from ancient sources. Thomas was skeptical, but he was willing to try anything that could help his daughter. The journey to Abigail's cabin took almost a full day along steep and poorly marked trails. When he finally arrived, he found a woman of indeterminate age, with long gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through people. She invited him in before he even explained why he was there, as if she already knew. Thomas told Sarah's story, including details he had never shared with the doctors, details about the murmuring about caves, about the presence Sarah felt, about how it all seemed connected in some way to the very place where they lived. Abigail listened to it all in silence, shaking her head occasionally, as if confirming something she already suspected. When Thomas finished, she was quiet for a long time before speaking. What she said was not what he expected to hear. Abigail explained that the Ozarks were ancient lands, places where the natives who lived there long before the European settlers recognized power and mystery. There were places in these mountains, she said, where the fabric between the world as we know it and other deeper places was thin. Caves were often these places, natural portals to spaces that existed beyond ordinary perception. She suggested that Sarah might have some kind of natural sensitivity to these energies, something that made her able to perceive or even partially cross these boundaries. The episodes, according to Abigail, were not illness in the sense that doctors would understand, but a kind of call or attraction to these other places. Sarah was being pulled into that liminal space, getting caught between worlds. The fact that the episodes had stopped suggested that she had finally found a balance, learned to resist the call, but the nightmares indicated that the connection still existed. That part of her still resonated with that other place. Thomas did not know what to make of these explanations. They were as far removed from logic and science as he could imagine, but at the same time, there was something about them that seemed to fit together in ways that all medical theories couldn't. Abigail prepared a mixture of herbs for Sarah, instructing Thomas on how to make a tea that she should drink every night before bed. She also gave him a small cloth bag containing what she called protective stones, minerals she had collected from specific parts of the mountains. Sarah was supposed to keep it under her pillow. Abigail didn't promise a cure, but she did say that these things could help strengthen Sarah's connection to the physical world, making it harder for that other presence to reach her. Thomas paid Abigail with provisions he had brought and returned home, still uncertain, but willing to try anything. When he told Margaret about the conversation, she was torn between skepticism and desperate hope. They decided not to tell Sarah about Abigail's theories, just to give her the tea and the bag without elaborate explanations. Surprisingly, or maybe not, Sarah's nightmares began to decrease in frequency and intensity after a few weeks of using Abigail's remedies. It could have been the placebo effect, or maybe the herbs had real properties to promote restful sleep, or maybe there was something else going on beyond scientific understanding. Sarah began to sleep better. Her appetite returned, and that constant shadow of tiredness finally began to dissipate. The Caldwell family, pragmatic at its core, didn't care much about why it worked, only that it worked. They continued with the nightly ritual of tea and the bag under the pillow. Over time, Sarah began to feel more present, more connected to the life around her. She still had that peculiar depth in her eyes, that feeling that she had experienced things beyond the ordinary, but now she seemed to have made peace with it somehow. She began to smile more, to participate in conversations more lightly, to find joy in small, everyday things that she had not noticed before. In the fall of 1828, the family received another visit from Dr. Whitmore, who had maintained a constant interest in the case over the years. He was impressed by Sarah's recovery and the fact that she had not had an episode in over 18 months. Whitmore conducted a few more tests, more for the completeness of his records than for the expectation of finding something new. Sarah was physically healthy, neurologically responsive, and seemingly free of the condition that had plagued her for years. Whitmore spent several days with the family, reviewing all of his old records and making final notes. He frankly admitted that he had never come up with a satisfactory explanation for what caused Sarah's episodes or why they eventually stopped. It was a medical mystery that would remain unsolved, at least within the limits of scientific knowledge at the time. Before leaving, Whitmore presented Sarah with a small leather journal, encouraging her to write her own memoirs and reflections on everything she had experienced. He suggested that perhaps one day when she was older, her words could help others facing similar conditions. Sarah gratefully accepted the diary and actually began writing in it, although she did so sporadically and privately. She never showed what she wrote to anyone in the family, keeping those pages as a sacred space where she could process experiences that she knew no one else could really understand. In the first few entries, her words were hesitant, fragmented, as if she was still learning the language necessary to describe what she had experienced. She wrote about the feeling of being trapped between two worlds, about how during the episodes she felt like she existed in multiple layers simultaneously. There were times when she could hear the voices of her family around, feel the touch of their hands, but it was as if everything came to her through a thick wall of water or glass. She could perceive, but she could not respond. She could not reach. Sarah also wrote about the presence she always felt during those states. She tried to describe it in different ways, looking for the right words that never seemed completely appropriate. It was not exactly a person or creature, but something more fundamental, as if it were the very consciousness of the place where she was trapped. It was observant, patient, and somehow curious about her. The following years brought a gradual but profound transformation in Sarah's life. She continued to help Margaret with household chores, but she also began to develop a particular interest in medicinal plants and the nature around her. She spent hours exploring the areas near the property, collecting herbs, observing patterns in plant growth, noticing how different species thrived in different conditions. It was as if her experiences had sharpened her perception to subtle aspects of the natural world that others did not. Margaret watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern, she saw her daughter becoming more and more introspective, more attuned to dimensions of reality that remained invisible to most people. Sarah began to have a reputation in the local community. Neighboring families occasionally came to her for advice on minor ailments, and she demonstrated an astonishing talent for identifying the right plants for different afflictions. She never claimed to have special knowledge or healing powers, but there was something about her quiet presence and deep eyes that inspired confidence. In 1829, when Sarah was 16, an incident occurred that brought a new dimension to her story. A small child from the Henderson family disappeared during an autumn afternoon. The 4-year-old boy had been playing near the house and simply disappeared. The family and neighbors searched for hours, calling out his name through the woods, sifting through every obvious place where a child might hide or get trapped. When night began to fall and the boy had not yet been found, panic really set in. The Ozarks were dangerous for a child alone, with their cliffs, wild animals, and ease with which one could get lost in the dense forests. Thomas joined the search, as did all the able-bodied men in the area. Sarah insisted on going too, despite her mother's objections. There was something about her determination that made Margaret give in. Sarah followed with the search parties, but while the others screamed and searched frantically, she moved more slowly with a contemplative quality, as if she were hearing something that no one else could detect. Eventually, Sarah separated from the main group, following an intuition she couldn't explain verbally. She walked for almost 2 kilometers through the forest, ignoring the distant cries of the other searchers who were calling her back. Something pulled her in a specific direction, an inexplicable certainty of where the boy was. She finally reached one of the cave entrances that dotted that region, a narrow opening partially hidden by bushes and vines. Sarah didn't hesitate. She entered the darkness with only a small flashlight she had brought. The cave stretched down at a steep angle, and Sarah had to move carefully so as not to slip on the damp rocks. She called out the boy's name, her voice echoing strangely through the rocky passages. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, she heard a faint cry coming from further on. Following the sound, Sarah found the boy huddled in a small chamber, frightened and cold, but unharmed. He had entered the cave looking for something he saw, and became disoriented in the darkness. Unable to find the exit, Sarah wrapped the boy in her shawl and carried him back out of the cave. When she emerged with the child in her arms, she found several of the searchers who had followed in the direction they had seen her take. The joy and relief were immense. The Hendersons were eternally grateful to Sarah for finding their son when everyone else had searched in the wrong places. But when asked how she knew where to look, Sarah didn't have a satisfactory answer. She simply said that she felt she had to go in that direction, that something had guided her there. The story spread quickly through the community, acquiring layers of exaggeration and mystical interpretation as it passed from mouth to mouth. Some said that Sarah had the gift of second sight, that her experiences with episodes of paralysis had opened up supernatural perceptions in her. Others were more skeptical, attributing it all to pure luck, or perhaps the fact that Sarah knew the region well and simply made an educated guess. Sarah herself didn't know exactly what to think. She wrote about the incident in her journal, trying to capture the sense of that inexplicable certainty that had guided her. She noticed that it was similar in some ways to the feeling she had during her episodes, that perception of being attuned to something beyond the normal 5 senses. In the winter of that year, Sarah had what would be her last major scare related to her former condition. She was helping Margaret cook dinner when she suddenly felt that familiar sense of disconnection beginning. The world around her began to slow down. The sounds became muffled. Her vision began to narrow. Sarah panicked, holding onto the kitchen table, fighting with all her willpower against the feeling of being pulled away. Margaret saw what was happening and ran to hold her daughter, talking to her constantly, keeping her grounded in the present. Sarah closed her eyes tightly and focused on her mother's voice, using it as a rope that kept her connected to the physical world. For several terrifying minutes, she swung on the edge of that familiar chasm, feeling the pull of that other place trying to drag her down. But this time, she managed to resist. Gradually, the feeling began to recede. The sounds returned to normal. Her vision cleared, and she remained present and conscious. When it finally passed, Sarah was shaking and sweating, but she had triumphed. She hadn't fallen back into that state. That incident was a watershed moment for Sarah. She realized that maybe the condition would never go away completely, that there would always be that connection or vulnerability, but that she could learn to resist, to stay grounded in the physical world through willpower and connections with the people around her. It was a revelation both empowering and frightening. In the following months, Sarah had some other similar moments, brief moments where she felt that attraction trying to pull her again. But she became more and more skilled at resisting. She developed techniques of her own, focusing intensely on physical sensations, clenching her hands until her nails dug into her palms, biting her tongue lightly. Anything that kept her firmly aware of her body. She also found that having someone talking to her, touching her, helped immensely. The presence and voice of another person served as anchors that prevented her from letting go completely. Margaret learned to recognize the signs when Sarah was struggling with an episode, and she always dropped what she was doing to stay by her daughter's side until the danger passed. In 1830, Sarah met Daniel Morrison during a fall fair in one of the region's largest cities. Daniel was a young carpenter of 22, skilled in his craft and known for his gentle and patient nature. He had heard the stories about Sarah. Everyone in the area knew at least exaggerated versions of her case, but when he met her in person, he saw beyond the legends. He saw a young 17-year-old woman with remarkable strength and depth, someone who had faced extraordinary challenges and emerged with grace and resilience. Daniel began courting her respectfully, visiting the Caldwell estate regularly, bringing small gifts he had made himself, wildflowers he collected, or simply his quiet company. Sarah was cautious at first, worried about what Daniel really thought about her condition and her past, but he repeatedly demonstrated that he did not see her as someone broken or cursed, but as someone extraordinarily strong for having survived what she did. Thomas and Margaret watched the development of that relationship with mixed feelings. They wanted Sarah to be happy, to have a normal life with her own family, but they also feared for what might happen if she had a severe recurrence of the episodes after getting married. They talked honestly with Daniel about the risks, about how Sarah still occasionally had moments where she had to fight that feeling of being pulled away from consciousness. Daniel listened to everything with serious attention and then said something that deeply reassured Sarah's parents. He said that everyone carries their own struggles and vulnerabilities, that no one goes through life without scars and challenges. Sarah had been tested in ways most people never would, and the fact that she was still there, strong and present, spoke of a courage he deeply admired. He promised that he would be there for her, that he would learn to recognize the signs and help her when needed, that they would build a life together, despite and perhaps even because of the unique challenges they would face. Those words meant everything to Sarah. For the first time since the episodes began, she felt that someone outside of her immediate family really saw her and accepted her completely. Sarah and Daniel were married in June of 1831 in a simple but meaningful ceremony held on the Caldwell estate. It was a clear, warm day, with gentle breezes blowing through the hills. Sarah wore a dress that Margaret had carefully sewn, a simple fabric, but decorated with delicate embroidery. As she walked to meet Daniel, her eyes sparkled with a happiness her family hadn't seen in years. The ceremony was brief, officiated by an itinerant preacher passing through the area, but the words were sincere, and the vows exchanged were profound. Daniel promised to be Sarah's safe haven in any storm, and Sarah promised to fully share her life with him, including the most difficult and scary parts. After the ceremony, there was a modest feast with neighbors and friends, simple but plentiful food, and music played with violins and banjos that some of the guests had brought. Sarah danced with her new husband, and for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to simply be present in the moment, without fear of the future or worry about the past. The couple established their own property about 5 miles from the Caldwell family, in an area with fertile land and access to a clean water stream. Daniel built a solid hut with his own hands, working meticulously to ensure that every joint was perfect, every board firmly placed. He wanted to create a home that was safe and comfortable for Sarah, a place where she could feel completely protected. During that first year of marriage, Sarah had only 2 moments where she felt that familiar pull, trying to pull her away from consciousness. On both occasions, Daniel was present and immediately recognized the signs. He held her hands, spoke to her steadily and calmly, keeping her grounded until the moment passed. His presence was incredibly effective, perhaps even more so than Margaret's had been. There was something about Daniel's quiet strength, his unwavering confidence, that Sarah could get through those moments that helped her find her own strength. After these incidents, they would talk at length about what Sarah had felt, about her techniques for resisting, about how Daniel could better help in the future. In the spring of 1832, Sarah discovered that she was pregnant. The news brought immense joy, but also deep concern. She feared that pregnancy could trigger a recurrence of the full episodes, or worse, that the condition could be passed on to the baby. She visited Margaret frequently during those months, seeking advice and comfort. Margaret assured her daughter that she was strong, that she had been through much worse and survived, and that this baby would be a blessing. During her pregnancy, Sarah did not have any episodes or even moments of attraction to that altered state. It was as if the presence of new life growing within her anchored her even more firmly into the physical world. She bloomed during those months. Her skin gained a healthy glow, and there was a serenity in her eyes that wasn't there before. In December of that year, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl, whom they named Margaret, in honor of her grandmother. Childbirth was difficult, as many births were at that time and place. But Sarah went through it with the same determined strength that had characterized her struggle against the